Well, we're here. We're at the bare block. There's nothing left to take off it except a couple of bearings and maybe some Welsh plugs. And now we can really get into why the 403 Oldsmobile is considered a really weak candidate for a performance engine. And if you haven't seen them already, here is one of the main reasons why. The main journals on the 403 Oldsmobile are completely machined and cut open. This is where a lot of the block's integrity kind of fails, because all of the metal and the strength in between the main crankshaft bearings is completely machined out. Now, this was done for a couple of reasons. One, it was a cost-cutting measure. The less metal that they have to put inside the blocks, the cheaper they can make them. Two, it was also a weight-saving measure, just to do anything to help keep the emissions down, which was one of the main concerns when most of these engines were being built. So, because so much metal and because these galleries are so open and missing from these main journals at high RPM, these can tend to kind of fail. They can kind of warp, they can kind of break free, as there is really limited strength in here. The only thing holding your main journals together is these three archways here, which are tiny. So at the end of the day, you really can't do much about this. You can put a girdle on the block, which is really good basic block insurance, but at a really high RPM, these are under a lot of load. They're under a lot of stress, and there is not much holding them in place there. So these are very susceptible to failure. So I've heard of this happening in a few cases. I've personally never seen a 403 like this fail, and there is a rumor that there were a handful of 403s manufactured where this metal wasn't cut out, but they've never been seen. They were rumored to be on some GMC motorhomes or Firebirds that were equipped with a factory towing package, which was around in 1977, but none of them have ever been found. None of them have ever been proven to exist, and no one has any clear documented examples that they do exist. But they were machined with main journals here and then just cut out or cut away. So this is one of the main reasons why these blocks can't take a real high RPM beating, even though plenty of people have. It's a risk you have to run with all of these journals. Now, the next reason why these can tend to be a bit of a challenging engine to build for high performance applications, and something that I have seen fail on them, is they have very thin cylinder walls. Now, essentially, this is a 350 Oldsmobile block, even though some people say, oh, the architecture is different, but realistically, it's an identical block to a 307 or a 350 Oldsmobile, but it has been significantly bored out. So in between each cylinder wall, there is very little metal in between them and no cooling jackets whatsoever. Now, this is an issue shared by a couple of other GM big cube V8s. Another example is kind of the 400 small block Chev, where the 400 small block Chev is like a 350, but again, it's so heavily bored out, there's not a lot of metal in between the journals. And I did have a 403 a long time ago, which had a lot of work done to it. It had been bored out 030, and the heads had had a little bit of work done to them as well. It was so thin on the walls here, you could see stress cracks in between the cylinders, and that block was basically toast. Once you've bored them out that far, you've got to remember there's just nothing in between them. Once they're getting so hot, this metal is expanding and contracting, and there's just not a lot of room to play with, which is why these are susceptible to cracking, and you really shouldn't be boring these out too much. Now, here is another major issue some, but not all of the 403 Oldsmobile engines have. Now, it might be really hard to spot, but you should be able to just make out these cylinders and these tubes inside the head. I'll zoom in there so you can get a better look. But this is a critical problem with the Californian and high altitude emissions 403 Oldsmobile engines. As mentioned earlier, these are the 403s that have the stainless steel EGR AIR pump lines that go into the heads. Now, if you can't see that, those are a bunch of air injection tubes inside the heads that pushed more cold air into your exhaust manifold to help burn the unburnt fuel that might be in the catalytic converter, or to trick the emissions testers into thinking not as much polluted air was coming out of the exhausts. But this is just BS. This is terrible, terrible for the head flow. And this is why these Californian 4A heads are absolutely terrible for performance. You have to think, look at those tubes in there blocking your exhaust port. That is inhibiting the amount of airflow coming out of these exhaust ports. There's no two way about it. This is a terribly designed head, and this is a terrible choice to use for performance Oldsmobile builds. Now, you can still probably get away with getting a little bit more performance out of them by either machining these tubes or cutting them out, just so your heads are flowing significantly better. But that's like sticking your finger in front of each one of the exhaust ports to block the air from coming out of them. These are just terrible. And this is why so many people think the 403 Oldsmobile is just a bad choice for a performance engine. At the same time, this was not the majority of the Oldsmobile engines. This is just the Californian VJ9 emissions heads. The federal Oldsmobile heads did not have these tubes inside them. And that makes an absolute considerable difference when you're trying to get performance out of these heads. Of course, you can always just bolt on some early 350 Oldsmobile heads. They normally say that the ones between 68 and 72 are really good for compression, or throw some Edelbrock aluminium ones on there and basically double your horsepower. But in terms of a stock rebuild, if you can get away with using a different set, try to use them. But these are the biggest failings of these heads on the 403. Aside from that, people might cite aftermarket parts availability and limited options in terms of performance for them, but realistically, there's more than enough aftermarket support to build one of these 403 engines. And you have to remember, at the same time, the 403 Oldsmobile was in production the same time the L78 400 Pontiac was. Now, contrasted to the W72 400 Pontiac, okay, there was no chance. You couldn't beat the W72. But the standard displacement 400 Pontiac that was in use at the time, or the standard displacement 400 small block Chev, or anything of similar nature in that emissions era, wasn't producing more power than the 403. It was making 185 horsepower in its stock configuration, with all this pollution and emissions BS blocking the heads, blocking the exhaust ports, choking and strangling this engine. So with minimal modifications, you can make the 403 rapidly perform better. I've seen just as many 500 series Pontiac cast engines blow as I have seen the 403 Oldsmobiles. So don't discredit the 403 just because you've read a couple of things online saying, oh, it's a terrible engine, you can't get any power out of it. You can get plenty of power out of it. Even in its stock configuration, you can make it a very responsive engine that's comfortable for driving around. So you're not going to be making big, drag, high horsepower engines out of this thing, but you'll still get plenty of power out of it, even with a couple of basic modifications. I've pulled out one of the spare camshafts I've taken out of a standard 403 I've taken apart, and looking at the two of them, it looks like they're actually really similar. Both of the lobes are about the same. They do have CWC markings on them, but both are in different locations, so it looks like maybe the bottom end of this thing hasn't been touched. Funnily enough, something else that I've noticed when I've been taking apart these connecting rods and bearings is that each one of them has a number of dots on them corresponding to which piston it is. So I don't know if this is the case on all 403s, but most of the ones that I've taken apart in recent history, all have had these dots on top of the connecting rods. This is to help keep them in order because, of course, when you take all of these out, you got to make sure that if you put them back in, they're all kept in order. So both the main journals and the connecting rods all had these dots. So conveniently enough, when this all goes back together, it'll be nice and organized.